Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, and I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you and all of my premium members at the Tenpenny Files. This is where we take a deep dive with important guests on important topics. You know, many of the people that I've interviewed, and this is my pleasure to invite back for the third time, John Barbour. John Barbour's entire CV and his background could take another hour and a half just to read and talk about. But he has so many amazing things, and I think that many of my premium members have already listened to part 1 and part 2 of his talks when we talked about the JFK assassination and also the Garrison files. Now today we're going to do a really special interview that is really what Deep Dive is all about. Deep Dive is taking you behind the scenes to ask some really personal questions, and you get to know somebody at a different level than what you've known them before. A lot of times we know what people do, but we really don't know who they are, what makes them tick, what keeps them going, and where their sense of self is. And many times on this interview that John and I have spoken to each other, you know, I'm a very Christian person, and so I've talked about God, and I always close out with a Bible verse, and he says he comes from a different perspective, that he doesn't believe in God. Is that correct? And that he has a different perspective. Now, everything in his life has been, in my opinion, so God-driven. I don't know why he can't see it. But we're going to get a good idea about what that really means today. So, John, I know you've been looking forward to this conversation, and so have I. So welcome to Deep Dive with Dr. T.
Oh, Sherri. I must tell you, I was expecting to do this interview a half an hour ago. And my wife said, "Are you still waiting for Sherri?" And I said, "Listen, she's the only human worth waiting for. Not only have I waited a half an hour to talk to her, I've waited 3 weeks to talk to her because the last time we talked, as you mentioned, we talked about our film, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And we also talked about my book, Your Mother's Not a Virgin, The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television. But Sherri, I must tell you, this will be the most important conversation I've ever had with another human being, because I've never talked about this openly. Because, to paraphrase Hamlet, to believe or not to believe, that is the question. And and talking about beliefs, you're talking about the very core of our being, which keeps us going and keeps us growing. I have some amazing, unbelievable stories to tell you that will make you more of a believer. Now, whether it makes me more of one, I don't know, but we will get to that. And I must tell you, when you'd mentioned this the last time we talked about, you just want to come on and talk about faith and beliefs. The first thing I thought about was Robert Frost, the poet. You remember Robert Frost, the poet?
Of course.
He was one of John Kennedy's favorite poets. And his favorite poet from Robert Frost was just a couplet. And it was a couplet that Robert Frost wanted engraved on his tombstone as his epitaph. And you know what it says? It says, "Dear God, please forgive all the little jokes I played on thee, and I will forgive the great big one you played on me." That was John Kennedy's favorite quote. And I thought about you immediately. And I'm looking so forward to this. You have no idea how much. I'm going to tell you very honestly, Sherri, I've been interviewed dozens and dozens of times, and since we talked last time, as a result of your show, I got a lot of calls by other hosts to be on their show. There's nobody I would rather talk to.
Aw, bless your heart.
And since this is the first time I've talked about this, I feel so enormously comfortable, and I wish I could hug you before we start. Oh, speaking of that, because we're separated by this COVID, I just posted this yesterday because I hear this a lot from a lot of my married golfing buddies. They say, you know, during this COVID, we go out and we have to wear masks. And then I have to go home and I have to wear earplugs. So I'm taking my earplugs off. Now, since you said you are so devout and you're a believer. And since you're the youngest one here in this duo, the younger one in the duo and the prettier one, I want you to start out and tell me a little about your background, because I don't know if you started out as a believer because your family instilled it in you, if you started out as a believer because it became an experience that you had. But I can't believe you stuck to it. I don't think anybody sticks to anything in life. I think they have shaky moments where they're in and out, but evidently you were in and out, but came back and came back stronger. So please tell me that story.
Well, it actually started when I was born. Seriously, I was born in 1958, and that was during a period of time when Catholics just didn't marry Protestants. And my dad was Catholic, and my mother was Protestant. And so, from the time I was born, there was a bit of a conflict. And in fact, when I was baptized, I was baptized on the same day, Catholic and Protestant, just to appease both sides of the family. And then I grew up in a Lutheran church, and then a very fundamentalist Christian church, really fire and brimstone, hellfire, and laying on hands and speaking in tongues. And it was a lot to handle as somebody a 9-year-old. And that's where between 9 and 14, I was involved in that church and had a lot of really negative experiences. And I went on to college. I was very involved in Bible study and, some on-campus things, Youth for Christ sort of things, but always at a periphery. And I went to medical school and had a kind of a run-in with our pastor there that was on campus. And I said, okay, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. It seems like every time I ask questions or I really want to learn something deeper, I get kind of like chided for I should just obey. So probably from my early 30s onward, I always felt like God was in my life. I always felt like, God was around. But then I spent a lot of years doing a lot of new agey things. I did a lot of things with astrology and tarot cards, and spent 5 years studying a practice called Eckankar. I looked into Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, Confucianism. I looked in all of these different things because I felt like if there was one God, why was there so many paths up to heaven? And because I'm a voracious learner, I always want to learn something new. So I spent lots of years doing that. My mother passed away in 2007, and she died of breast cancer, and she was in hospice right here in my dining room is where she passed away on her bed. And before she died, she said, Sherri, don't throw Jesus out. Just don't do it. And I remember when she said that, I thought, I don't know if I can do this Jesus thing, Mom. I had such a bad experience with that when I was a kid. I don't know. I didn't say that out loud, but that was what went through my head. So that was in 2007. And so I've just been sort of what I would define as a very lukewarm Christian most of my adult life. I believed in God. I believed in the resurrection. I believed in the basic gospel of Christ, but I was never really on fire about it. And then in July of 2019, a girlfriend of mine asked me to go on a spa retreat weekend with her. And if I would have known what was going to happen on that weekend, I probably wouldn't have gone. But we went on the spa retreat weekend, and it started out pretty innocently. We sat down for dinner that night, and she reached across the table, and she said, well, let's say grace, so we could pray. And I said, okay, I can do that. And she took hold of my hands, and for 4 days, she was like a dog with a bone. She was not going to let go of me until she moved my heart and said, God needs you on the playing field. And all this work you've done with vaccines and all these things for this long, we're heading into a period of time. Remember, this is summer of 2019. She said, we're heading into a period of time when human beings can't do this alone anymore. We need to put God on the playing field. And you are one of the team captains of the team. You need to get on God's team. And I left home. This was in Pittsburgh, and I live in Cleveland. And so when I left that weekend, it was like a 2.5-hour drive home, and I didn't have on the radio or anything. I was just like, oh, man, what am I going to do with this? And she just kept at me and kept at me and kept at me. And kind of I realized that maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. It wasn't going to be a big negative experience again like I had in the past. And then I met somebody in December on a vacation I was on who became a really good friend and is very strong in his walk with God. And on January 1st, 1/1/2020, I was on an airplane flying home from St. Thomas, and I said, okay, God, I'm in. This is bigger than us. We're fighting powers and principalities. This is a spiritual warfare. This really isn't about guns and bullets. And if we want to fight this vaccine battle, they've got us outnumbered, outmoneyed, outpowered, outmediated, out everything. The only person they can't do bigger than is you. So God, put me on your team. I'm willing to be a general. Put me in the biggest possible places that you can put me, and use me to your service to save as many people as possible from this dastardly vaccine. And that was January 1st of last year, and I've just gotten stronger and deeper and broader and more vocal about my beliefs, and they really resonate with me to the core of my being.
Oh, you got 5 stars on your shoulder, Angel. You really are. You are one of the leading generals. There you go. And I absolutely adore you. And Mike, it's funny you said your parents were of different religions. When I started out my act, I said, my mother was Jewish and my father was Scotch, which proved that you could mix anything with Scotch. So my coming to the Bible was quite accidental and quite hungry because of my desperateness and my aloneness. As I mentioned before, coming from a severely broken home in Toronto, born in the Salvation Army Hospital Charity Ward, severely broken home, long before it was popular and I was out on the street. The thing that sort of saved me from heartbreak was the fact, and I don't know where it came from, I had a sense of humor that popped out of me that I did not understand, and I didn't know the core of it. Sometimes as an adult, I think I'm channeling Mark Twain. That's very, 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 very serious. But when I was 11 or 12 years of age, and we had a teacher, a history teacher in our public schools. His name was Hetherington. He was the only fat man in Canada. There were no fat people in the 40s. The only fat person I ever saw was Sidney Greenstreet in those old Warner Brother movies. So that was the American fat man. And our teacher, Hetherington, was so heavy, he had to have a special desk built. He had to have a special chair built. And now he was a good history teacher, being British, but he was the most miserable human being in the world. And he would sit down and he would moan and groan about life and how rotten it was and how terrible everything was before he got into the history lesson. And one day he's leaning forward in his chair and he's rubbing his leg. He said, "Oh, God, my ankle's swollen." And I'm sitting in the back of the room and I mumbled to my friends, "How can you tell?" That fat man moved faster than he ever did in his whole life, ran down the aisles, grabbed me, took me to the principal. Now, in those days, you had what they call corporal punishment, and they would take a leather metal strap and they beat me so hard on my hands, I still have a scar on my finger. So I felt really desperately alone. I had 6 very close friends, and we all had hockey teams because there were 6 hockey teams in the National Hockey League at the time. The only one who did not swear, the only one who was a sweet soul, was a young 12-year-old named Don Lee. I lived on Lawler Avenue, a block away on Scarborough near Kingston Road, lived Don Lee and his only child, wonderful mother and father, and they lived across from a Baptist church. And that's why they moved there, to be next to the church. Well, one day, one afternoon, feeling desperate and alone, I went over and I knocked on the door. Now, Sherri, I could have phoned. But the reason I didn't phone, I was afraid they'd say no, because I wanted to go over there and knock on the door. Mrs. Lee answered the door. "Oh, Johnny, how are you? Don's not home, but he'll be home soon. Would you like to come in, and what would you like?" And I said, "Would you adopt me?" It just blurted out of my mouth. And she smiled. She said, "Well, I can't adopt you. You have a mother." And I said, "Well, come on over to my house and I'll prove to you I haven't. It's empty. She's in Buffalo with another one of my uncles." Okay. She said, "Oh, John, I'm sorry, but she will be coming home." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I hope she does or not. But in any way, would you adopt me?" She said, "No, I can't." she said, but how would you like to come to church with us every Sunday? Have you ever been to church? And I said, I don't know if I've ever been to church. I guess if I was I was baptized there, I might have been in church. Did they circumcise you in church, Mrs. Lee? Or if they did, I was in church. Well, she howled. She said, no, John, come on in. I have something for you. So she handed me a book, and I said, what's this? She says, it's a Bible. I said, a what? She said, a Bible. I said, really? Yes. She said, what I want you to do, I want you to take this home. I want you to read it. I want you to come with us every Sunday to church. It's right across the street. So I went home and I started to read it. And I loved it. I loved the words. I mean, I already as a kid, I was a fan of Shakespeare. I read everything I could come across, but I loved the poetry in it, from Genesis to Revelations. Okay, so Sunday we go to church. I remember two of the experiences in the first meeting in the church. In the middle of the service, a baritone. I remember his name. I was 12, Angel. I mean, that was 70 some odd years ago. His name was John Decker, and he sang the Lord's Prayer. And at the end, he hit that high note, Amen. And his vibrato just shook the stained glass and it echoed. And I leaped up and I applauded. I was the only one standing and applauding in a church. That's how little I knew. So everybody laughed, thought, oh my God, this guy's new to church. and then the pastor did something really interesting. He stopped in the middle of the service and he said, now it's time for your private prayer and your private moment with God in God's house. We're going to take 1 minute for you to pray to God on your own for whatever you want. And then we'll be back to the service. And of course, Sherri, I prayed that when I got home, my father would be there. He deserted us, right? So when the service was over, Mrs. Lee invited me for lunch at the house. And I said, no, I got to get home. My father's going to be there. So I ran home and I ran in. I saw, Dad. And it was an echo. He was never there. So this happened for the first 2 or 3 weeks. Then I stopped going home and hollering for my father because he never shut up. It was the 13th week. And when the pastor said, we're going to take this moment to have a private prayer, I got up and I walked out of the church and I sat down on the brick steps to wait for Don Lee's family to come out. Everybody noticed me leaving. Well, the first person that the pastor came to when he was saying goodbye to everybody and see you next Sunday, he came over and he patted me on the shoulder. I almost cried. It was the first one anyone ever touched me. I almost cried. And they called me son. Well, that even made my eyes wetter. And he said, are you okay? So I had to be very honest. I said, sir, Father, whatever they call you, I have to be very honest with you. This is not for me. He said, what's not for you, John? I said, this praying business. I said, I've been doing this for 12 weeks now, going home, hoping my father and praying my father's being there. And I said, I don't pray at home because I sleep I wet the bed. And I have broken springs in the bed, so I'm always sleeping in puddles of pee. So I don't want God to smell where I'm praying from. So I come here and I look forward to the prayers. And they're never answered when I'm going home. So I just can't do this anymore. And then there was a crowd around us listening to this conversation. And he said, John, you must understand God's will. And I looked at him and I said, I don't think I'm in it. And the people started to laugh. So he got a little upset that they were laughing at my little joke, and I don't know where it came from. He said, don't let Satan take over your life. And I blurted out, do you believe in Satan? I hear you talking about him every week. And he said, certainly. And everybody said, yes, yes, yes. And I said, well, isn't that proof there's no God? And it got deathly still. I mean, really still. Everybody. I sensed they didn't like me anymore. He said, how can you say such a thing? And I said, well, if God is all powerful, why doesn't he get rid of him? Now, that was out of the mouth of a 12-year-old. Sherri, intellectually, I think I'm 5,000 years old. Chronologically, I'm 87. but emotionally, I'm only 8. And it's the 8-year-old that I like because out of the mouths of babes. So I was a non-believer. But I'm going to tell you something really strange. And I've got a couple of these unbelievable stories to tell you that almost make me believe that there has been some kind of divine intervention in my life, which I do not understand. 35 years later, so I was 12 at the time, at 47, I have the #1 show in America on television after being deported twice from this country. And what we would do, because the show was live, during commercial breaks, I would walk into the audience looking for people to say, "Hi and welcome to Real People," or "Real People will be right back after this commercial." All just people in the stands. And I'm walking up the aisle, and guess who I see? This round face of a 46-year-old man sitting there with his wife and 2 children. And I know it's Don Lee. And I say, "Are you Don Lee?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you Johnny McLaren?" That was my birth name, John. My father had changed the name. I was born John Barbour. But when my father, like an immigrant that I was, came from Scotland to Canada, he didn't want to become successful by working harder. He wanted to become successful by lying more. And the most famous writer in Scotland was a guy named McLaren. And my father claimed he was the brother of McLaren. So he changed his name to McLaren, and he convinced the Toronto Daily Star, and they hired him as a reporter.
Oh, wow.
So investigative journalism wasn't one of the Toronto Star's strong points. And they hired my father. And I told the audience when I was 12, I wanted Don's parents to adopt me. And Don grabbed the microphone and he said to the audience, "Johnny should be very thankful that my mother and father never adopted him. Otherwise, he'd be sitting here next to me and somebody else would be up there with Sarah Purcell and Skip Stevenson." Is that astonishing?
Yes. So we. It's funny because I always say, John, that we can only see. It's like being in a car and driving down a pitch black road. There's no ambient light at all. And the only light at all, and you're driving at 100 miles an hour, and the only light at all is just the light, like the 30 feet or so with your headlights. Well, that's how much light God gives us to see. That's about how far we can see ahead. But he can see the whole length of the road. He knew us before we were born. He knows the whole journey of our life and beyond that life. And where that to me is where trust comes in, because you're driving 100 miles an hour, you can only see this far ahead. And you're sitting in the passenger seat, and God's got his hands on the steering wheel.
Well,
and then trust is trusting that you're going to be safe, you're going to be taken care of, you're going the right direction. God can see the whole length of the road, even though you can only see 30 feet in front of you.
Well, for me, that made me feel insecure because I wanted my future to be in my own hands. But you've heard the saying, there are no atheists in the foxholes. And I was in the foxhole of life, and it happened when I was 29 years of age. I was being deported for the second time. Okay, I had gotten into now here I am, 29. I don't know a whole lot, but I've studied everything about American history. I just want to learn everything about the country that I want to become a citizen of. And this young accountant who was a Republican started bashing away at Fidel Castro and what a commie he was. He stopped me as I was going into my apartment just to go to bed. And for some reason, he picked me to talk to. And I said, for the last 6 months, Fidel Castro has been the biggest star in America, because after he overthrew Batista, he came to the United States. He was on the Jack Paar show, the Ed Sullivan show, the Today show. He ate chicken with 20,000 blacks in Harlem. I said he was absolutely all over the place for 6 months. I mean, he was like Viva Zapata, so don't tell me. He said, well, he's a commie. And I said, well, we made him a commie. Now, I'm not very smart politically, but I had read this. So I said, listen, I'm going to tell you something. Fidel Castro threw out Batista. Okay, Now he's having a revolution. In order for a revolution to be successful, in Castro's own words, you have to have manufacturing, you have to have jobs. So what it is there is a refinery in Havana, and the Americans offer him oil at $3.58 a barrel. And the Russians offered to him at half of that price. Now, if you're a businessman, what are you going to do? You're going to deal with the Russians. So he bought the Russian oil. And I said, when it showed up in Havana, American refineries refused to refine it. Now, he had a choice. What does he do? He gives in to the Americans or he confiscates it. So he confiscates it. And then this Republican screamed at me, he said, that's right, he's a commie. I said, hold it, he wasn't. He confiscated it like eminent domain they do in this country when they tear down a house for a highway. He repaid the oil companies. He said, what are you talking about? I said, he looked up what they claimed the property was worth in their income taxes, and he repaid them. And I said the same with the King brothers in Texas, the largest ranchers in Texas. You cannot grow potato in Cuba without permission of the King brothers. So he confiscated their property. And guess what? Fidel Castro's father was a very wealthy doctor. The first family's property confiscated was his own father's family. So he would have done business with the Americans, but they wouldn't do business with him, and now he's become an enemy. Well, he picked up the phone, he called the FBI, and they arrested me immediately. And I went in front of a mirror. I tell a story in my book. It's called Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. I was thinking of committing suicide. I've known more people in my life, Sherri, at my age, who've committed suicide rather than died of natural causes. And I knew it also at 29. My grandfather committed suicide when I was just a kid. I don't want to get into that. So it surrounded me all my life. And I was looking in the mirror, but I wasn't looking at me. I was looking for me. And then I thought, all these terrible things that people did to kill themselves. They jumped off buildings, jumped under railroad tracks. They slashed their wrists, blew their heads off, and their families had to clean it up. Why would they hurt themselves more than life? And then I thought, you know what? If I do that, nobody is going to miss me. And I was terribly curious about what was going to happen next in my bizarre life. And I was kind of happy about that. So I'm deported. And I have to stay at the YMCA. And there was a little small cathedral, if you'll call it that, a little small praying room in the YMCA with just this wonderful solitary statue of Jesus. And I walked in and I sat in the back of the room. And I started to debate with myself, should I pray out loud? Or, because then I'd be a hypocrite if I pray out loud. But I was so desperate. So I thought, no, I'll sit in the back. He knows I'm here. I'm thinking to myself. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to think my prayer. And the prayer that I prayed was this. The immigration laws forbid the United States government to allow me to re-enter the United States because after the age of 16, I committed 2 felonies. If you commit 1 felony, they can forgive you. But if you commit 2 felonies, there is no way you could ever be admitted to the United States of America. It would take an act of Congress, like Operation Paperclip, to bring all these German scientists over here. And that certainly wasn't going to be me. I had the best immigration lawyer in America. His name was Sidney Kaplan, paid for by a stranger who liked me. His name was Abe Pelter. Great story in the book. His family sort of adopted me. And he paid for everything. I'm a stranger, but he paid for everything. And Sidney Kaplan told me I would never get back into the country, get used to it, and don't try to get married while they're deporting you because you probably not even get back in then. What I prayed for silently was to have enough intelligence and patience to stick it out. I cannot change the law, but there must be something I could do. And what it is that I did, I spent months in the Toronto Law Library. I became more of an expert on immigration law than anybody in the world as this young 29-year-old. And what I thought, there's only one thing I can do. There is something called intent in the law. What I will do is I will write up a draft. Oh, my friend, his name was Mel Nixon. Oh my gosh, he looked like Tyrone Power. He was more of a troublemaker than I was. He's the guy that did all these crimes with me, okay? And he ended up going to Korea and he became a war hero. And he was welcomed back to Canada and they had a parade for him. Mel Nixon. God, he should have been a movie star. Great black hair, dark eyes, beautiful teeth. And wow, he was a hero. So he was the one who helped me commit these crimes. So now I had to try to find Mel Nixon. How do I find Mel Nixon, who's this great war hero, to talk about what it is that I have in mind? So I look up in the phone book, and there's the address and the phone number on Lawler Avenue. I call, and his sister answers, who remembers me. Oh, Johnny, how are you? I'm looking for Mel. Is he there? She said, no, he's in prison. I said, what? She said, he's in prison in Sudbury. I said, what for? She said, well, he took a machine gun into a bank and tried to rob it, like Willie Sutton. I said, you're kidding. You're kidding. So he's in prison. And she gives me the address. I get on a train and I go there to meet him. And he still looks as handsome as ever and has a great smile. And I tell him, you know what? The thing that I'm doing is we committed these two crimes in the same day. And what I want to do is I want to say I used the first crime to help me commit the second crime. So they become one part of one accident or one action, and see how they reinterpret it. Because if to enter the United States after you've been deported, you need to get yes, both from the Consul General in Toronto, and you have to get a yes from the Immigration Service. But first you have to get the yes from the Consul General. So I said, I'm writing this proposal up, and I would like you to sort of authenticate it with me that it was all part of one action. He said, John, I'll take the whole blame myself. No, you won't, Mel. They know you're in here for 20 years, for God's sake. You'll say anything to help an old friend. No, just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. It was my idea and you helped me. So he wrote it out. And guess what? I went before the Lady Consul General. And this may be one of the reasons I have such an affinity for you, Sherri. She looked exactly like you.
Oh, my.
Your age, and she wore this gorgeous blue suit. And then I presented my case. And you know what? I studied everything. I knew every president, every war, every congressman, every senator, every capital of every state. And I was waiting for them to ask me all kinds of questions. And they asked me a question I was not prepared for. And guess what the question was?
Why do you want to be an American?
Exactly.
Oh, my.
I had never thought of it. I was totally stunned. And so I started talking about, it was the only land in the world that was built on built on laws, the only country in the world made up of residents of every other country in the world, a land of new beginnings. I went into this Frank Capra, Jimmy Stewart speech. She was absolutely motionless, standing and listening to me. No smiles, nothing. And when it was over, she just stared at me and she said, Mr. Barbour, I do not want to be the one to spoil your American dream. So I'm going to say yes. You can apply for permission. So I called Sydney in Los Angeles, all excited. She said, yes, now all I got to do is go to the Immigration Service. He said, John, don't bother. Go get your passport because you're going to get your green card. I said, no, I got to go to immigration. He said, it's all taken care of. Just get your passport. You're going to be on a plane to the United States. And he said to me on the phone, he said, God, when you come to this country, you better get yourself a talk show because nobody in the world could have done what you had just done. And I must tell you, I was 29 years of age. It was the happiest day of my life getting my green card to come to the United States. Now, I end up in the same apartment building I'd been deported from. And guess who moves in? A fellow named Mort Lockman, who is Bob Hope's head writer for 25 years,
Wow.
befriends me. And downstairs is the director of a children's show. And I'm just there 1 week. And the director of the children's show said, this children's show that I do, it's called Chuckle the Clown. It's on ABC in the morning. He said, they're looking for a new producer. I know you're interested in show business. Why don't you look at the show and I'll set up a meeting with Mrs. Runyon, who is Chuck's wife, who runs everything, and see if they would like to hire you as the producer. So I said, look at it every morning. So I looked at the first 10 minutes of it, and it was god awful. I mean, just terrible. So anyway, he had set up the meeting with Mrs. Runyon, Chuck's wife. So we met in a restaurant, and it was an old folks restaurant. For some reason, they picked this old folks restaurant on Los Feliz Boulevard. And then I loved that lady because she had the greatest laugh. And she says, you know why we eat here at the old folks restaurant? I said, why? Because the food is soft? Well, she howled. And anyway, she says to me, did you watch the show? I said, I watched it for 10 minutes. She said, you didn't watch it the whole week? I said, no, I watched it for 10 minutes. Why only 10 minutes? I said, because it was so god-awful boring. And then I said, first of all, tell me how your husband became a clown, why he became a clown, how he ended up on ABC. So she told me the story. And I said, one thing that I hated when I was a kid was when my mother would talk to me. She would talk baby talk like I was not the same human being as her friends. Your husband talks to the kids like they're babies. They know he's a human being and he dresses as a clown. Have him talk as a human being to the kids and then put on his clown voice and they'll know he is acting. And the kids don't want to watch cartoons. The kids are competitive. So we're going to make up games. They're going to have spelling games. They're going to have physical games. She hired me on the spot. And that was my first job in television, was being the producer of a children's show on ABC.
And would you call all of that series of events that you just described a bunch of coincidences? You wouldn't see God's hand in any of that?
Well, you know what, Angel? A lot of people have said that to me, and I'll tell you something else where I sort of see, if you say it's God's hand, I can only report the fact, like Jack Webb and Dragnet, just the facts, man. I can't see God. I can't know God. But I know it's like Hamlet says to Horatio, there are things on heaven and earth, Horatio, that are not dreamt of in your philosophies. Also, I remember the great quote from Julius Caesar talking about Brutus. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Shakespeare always alluded to a higher being himself, and I believe that man was inspired, if there is a God, to write it. He became the greatest writer in history, Mark Twain.
So why do you still think there is not?
Well, because, I feel it, but I don't know it, and of course, feelings are a lot better than knowing that. So another story, I had quit the business when I was 46 years of age. I had won 5 Emmys, only one in television to win Emmys for both entertainment and news. The only job I had now was a film critic at Los Angeles Magazine. Nobody would hire me, except a lot of people hired me to write jokes. And I had literally quit the business. Now, I have 2 stories I want to tell you. Oh, I have 3. One is about the divine intervention that created the movie, the divine intervention that created my becoming the solo writer for Frank Sinatra for 4.5 years, and the divine intervention that accidentally got real people on the air. Now, these are 3 stories that would make one a believer.
Wait, without even telling the stories, because I know they're beautiful, because you're a great storyteller, why wouldn't that make you a believer?
Well, because you know what? It puts my future in someone else's hands and not mine. And I've been forced, because of my background, to depend upon myself. And I don't want to give up depending on anyone else except myself for what it is I have. Now, I know, Angel, that these things happen. So which story would you rather hear? Because the three of them are just astounding believer stories. Yeah, you can have the one where I accidentally got real people on the air. You could have the one where I accidentally came up with the money to get the Garrison tapes on the air, which is unbelievable. Or the story of how I accidentally became Frank Sinatra's private writer.
Or the all 700 pages of stories in your book.
That's very funny. Oh, and speaking of a book, just yesterday, my second book just went up on Amazon.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes, all because of you. It's called John Barbour, the wittiest man in America. And then in small print at the bottom is a Canadian. So there you go. All because of you. But in any event, let's see. I think let me tell the Frank Sinatra story first, because that's sort of the most personal one. As a film critic at Los Angeles, do you remember the movie The Great Gatsby?
Yes, of course.
Robert Redford, and Mia Farrow was in it also. In any event, it was produced by Paramount, and the president of Paramount at the time was a guy named Phyllis Diller. I mean, his real name was Barry Diller, but he was really a Phyllis, and that's what I called him all the time, is Phyllis Diller. In any event, it was on the cover of Time magazine. It was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. The couple of critics back in New York who saw Gene Shalit just absolutely raved about the movie. And I went to see it. Now, Barry Diller had said, not only will this become the most successful movie in history, at the time, the ticket sale price for a movie was $3. And he said, this movie is so successful, we're going to double the price to $6. But everyone who buys Paramount stock is not only going to make money from the movie, but we're going to sell Gatsby clothing, because the movie in color was filled with these fabulous clothes and it was photographed beautifully. And Jack Clayton did a nice job as the director, but the story was told badly. And it was an absolutely boring, god-awful movie. So when I reviewed it, now you have all of these Gatsby parties going on in Bel Air and in Century City and billboards all over town. And here you have Johnny Barbour and NBC saying the only way that Barry Diller is ever going to get $6 for this movie if he charges $3 to get in and $3 to get out. So anyway, everybody got the quote, and the movie bombed. So the phone rings, and it's George Slaughter. George Slaughter was the co-creator of Laugh-In, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The real creator of the show was a drunken Englishman named Digby Wolfe. Great story in the book. He created Laugh-In, but George Slaughter was a smart businessman, and he ended up owning it. And and the show was shut down after 3 years because of him, because he got into legal battles with Rowan and Martin. It became known as Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. You might remember that. Well, that hurt Slaughter's ego, and the show died after 3 years, unbelievably. And so, in any event, he had a contract to do a revival of Laugh-In. And he called me. He said, John, can I have that joke? And I said, George, you can have anything you want. Just pick up LA Magazine and just take whatever you want. He said, no, I mean, you got bunches of them. And I said, George, I got a better idea. You know, Laugh-In has nothing more than 8 or 10 seconds long. Why don't you hire me as your critic at large? I'll come on and I'll do a couple of jokes and I'll write the rest of it. He said, can you start? I said, tomorrow. So I went in the next day. And he said to me, the first guest was going to be Frank Sinatra. And I said, oh, is he going to be the host? He said, no, we're not having hosts. I said, why not? He said, because of Rowan and Martin. I said, but George, you've got to have a host. People need to identify with somebody, even if they can't speak English. Look at Ed Sullivan. he funked up all the time and was the biggest star on television. You need a host. He said, no, I'm not going to have the Rowan and Martin problem again. So anyway, Sinatra was going to be his first big, great guest. When they tape the shows, Angel, there is no audience. It's all canned laughter. So when Sinatra came into the studio, he came in with 3 Italians and a couple of other people. They always had an entourage around him. And there was nobody else there except a couple of crew members, George Slaughter and Digby Wolfe with the material. I had been assigned to write some stuff for Sinatra. And I was sitting in the very, very back of the studio because I was so afraid to be near him. The first time I had seen him, I was 17 when I was at the Calneva Lodge, and he walked into the Calneva Lodge with Sam John Connor. I was 17 years of age. And now here I am in my 40s, and he's coming on stage. So he could be very crude and rough. So he took some of the material that George handed him, and he said, who wrote this crap? And he would throw it on the ground, throw it on the ground. And then there was silence, and then Digby handed him a piece of paper, and he said, well, take a look at this, Mr. Sinatra. So he starts to chuckle, and Frank Sinatra hated a critic named Rex Reed. Do you remember? Rex Reed was the most famous on television movie critic in America at the time, very gay, and he hated Sinatra's movies, and Sinatra hated him. And one of the jokes I had for Sinatra was, Rex Reed finally found something he likes, a blue dress. So I had a bunch of other jokes. He was born in Hoboken, and God, why do I remember this? Hoboken, that's ancient Roman for hoe house. So I had, and he loved it. And then he loved it. So he said, who wrote this? And Digby points up and he says, Johnny, up there. So he looks up and he does this with his finger. Come here, kid. I'm in my 40s. I'm 44. Come here, kid. So I come downstairs. He said, you wrote this? And I said, yes. And then Digby he said, hold it. You're the guy that's also the critic on Channel 4, the movie critic, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir. I'm known as the heterosexual Rex Reed. Well, he howled. And then Digby said, well, you know, he also has a comedy album called It's Tough to Be White. He said, give it to me. I want to show Sammy. And I said, oh, no, Mr. Sinatra. The LA Times bombed it. They said it was the worst taste comedy album ever written. He said, that's all the more reason for you to give it to me. I hate the LA Times. He said, send it over to Dorothy at Formosa Studios. Here's the address. We're going to get together. So then I figured it's over. Then the very next day, I get a letter hand-delivered. Now, you can't see it, but it's on my wall there. Frank Sinatra says, you're all mine now, Johnny. We're going to do a lot together. So anyway, I start writing material for him. And whether it was one joke, as a matter of fact, one of my letters to People magazine, it's in Kitty Kelly's book called His Way, Frank Sinatra, His Way. He would give me $1,000. And I said, I asked him for a check so I could just put it on the wall. He said, no, because you won't cash it. And if you don't use the money, you're not going to write anything else. So it was always brand new $100 bills. So anyway, he calls me into his office one day. I was stunned when I went into his office. Look at my office behind me. That's embarrassing. I have all these things about stars. There's Muhammad Ali and Ronald Reagan and Red Fox and all of these famous people. He had nothing like that in his office. He only had one picture. It was a picture of his mother. That's the only picture that he had in his office. He was dressed very casually in a nice yellow sweater, tan slacks. Just wonderful. And he says to me, I'm going to make you famous. And I said, you are? He said, yeah, you deserve to be seen on stage again, you know? So I want you to be my opening act. And he tells me where we're going to open all around the country. And he said, you're going to make 10 times what you make every week and you make as a critic. And I said, you know, I would love to, Mr. Sinatra. And he kept interrupting me. John, it's Francis. It's Francis. I said, Francis, I would love to, but I can't. He said, what do you mean you can't? I said, I have a 10-year-old boy, and I never wanted a child. The reason I never wanted a child, because I never had a childhood. I never had a father. I never had a mother. I don't want to get into that, I said. But now that I have my son, I remember everything I missed as a child. I do not want my son to ever miss his father. So I'm just going to stay here, take him to his junior golf tournaments, and take him to school. Well, he almost got tears in his eyes. He said, John, you only make $350 a week, for God's sake. You're going to make nearly $5,000 a week. I said, I don't care. I just have to be around
Wow.
my son. He said, well, John, I want to do something with you. So I blurted out. I said, you know what you should do, Francis? You should do an Italian Roots. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, remember Kunta Kinte on ABC, that series called Roots? I said, let's do an Italian Roots. I said, your hero was Bing Crosby. He died at 77 last year of a heart attack on a golf course in Spain. And you go to any restaurant now, you never hear a Bing Crosby song. You never hear it on Golden Oldies radio. I said, you were more than a singer. He said, hey, don't be putting down my boy. He was my idol. And I said, no, but you're sort of my idol, because not only I'll tell you, 100 years from now, you go into any Italian restaurant, you're going to hear Frank Sinatra singing, okay? But you were a social force. If it hadn't been for you and the Rat Pack, John Kennedy would not be president of the United States, because you sang that great song, High Hopes for Frank Sinatra, and that got him elected. So here's what I would like to do. I'd like to bring a camera to your home in Palm Springs every weekend. Saturday and Sunday, I'll put the camera on you, and I'm going to interview you for months and months and ask you a lot of pointed questions. Because the first time I ever saw you with Sam Giancana when I was 17. And he leaned over I'm not going to say exactly what he said. He said, but you got guts, kid. He said something else besides guts. It was lower on the anatomy. I said, well, Mrs. Sinatra, listen, it may or may not be in the finished film, but you will never hear me. And what we're going to do, we're going to edit it down to 5 1-hours. You are going to be the only performer in history to have a visual autobiography. America will stop every night. Everybody who has a television set is going to be watching that. And he just glowed. He said, would you write 10 to 12 pages of that and give it to Dorothy as soon as you can? I'd love to do that. So I wrote it up, and the next day I delivered it to Dorothy. And I didn't hear from him for a while, and then I thought it was over. Now, when I thought it was over, I'm 46, and I decided to quit the business because I can't get a job. Sinatra hasn't called, and the only thing I can do is I can get a job as a comedy writer. I remember, Angel, exactly where I was. I was on Foreman Avenue, right next to the 10th fairway of the Lakeside Country Club. My little bungalow was across the street. And I said to myself, I'm never going to be a star. I better give up the ghost. I love my son. I love being with my son. I've got the greatest wife in the world, who's the best mother in the world. I love writing jokes. I love being home. I'll just be a joke writer. I'm 46. It was the only time in my life, Sherri, that I felt at peace. I'd given it all up. In other words, people like yourself, give it to God. I didn't know who I was giving it to, but I just gave it all up. It was the most peaceful day of my entire life, and I'm 46.
Wow.
I'm past middle age. So I go into the house, and I hugged
So now, wait a minute. Before you do that, stop on that.
Okay.
Who did you think you were giving this up to? If you don't believe in God and you don't think that there's a God there that you could trust, and I want to read something to you because I think it's important. It plays into this conversation we're having about God and spirituality. And it's something that I go back to a lot. And you said, you'd read the whole Bible and you read a lot of it and you liked the prose. And I like the Proverbs and I like the Psalms. And Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 is this: trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding, and always acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. And and so that's not a request, it's a command.
Yes,
And
but you
trust
know
it.
who it sounds like? It sounds like Joseph Campbell, who said, "Follow your joy, and doors will open in the universe that you don't know exist that will lead you to that joy." Okay, so you call that mystery God. So we will call it God but this is what happened, which is even more unbelievable.
Okay.
I go in the house. I'd given it up to the ghost. Okay, whatever's going to happen to me, I'll write jokes. Okay, and the phone rings, and it's Digby Wolf. Now, 2 years before that, I had created Real People, and I had the pilot at ABC, and my Byron Allen was going to be Richard Pryor. And they said they wouldn't put that nigger on the air. And so we lost it. I mean, that's how foul they were at the time. And everybody knew that I'd gone on, I'd been quoted by Maury Gelman in Daily Variety saying I was going to change the face of American television with what I called the entertainment of reality. But ABC passed on it. So it was over with. But I'd already shot the pilot, but they didn't want it. So anyway, the phone rings and it's Digby. And Digby says, "What are you doing?" And I said,
And who's Digby?
Digby Wolf was the co-creator of Laugh-In.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so Digby, so I worked with him on the revival of Laugh-In. We got along great. Guy was brilliant and funny. And so he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Fathering." He said, "What do you mean, father?" I said, "Well, I just quit the business." He says, "Well, you might want to get back into it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I have a contract at Westinghouse." And I remember when Merv Griffin left Westinghouse to go to ABC, John, he recommended you as his replacement. And weren't you under contract at Westinghouse for one time? And I said, "Yes." I said, "When my wife got pregnant and I was broke, all of a sudden I get this contract from Westinghouse to replace Merv Griffin." All these divine interventions. And that's the exact phrase I use with Digby. He said, "Well, this is some more divine intervention. I have a contract with Westinghouse to create some new shows. The only thing new I've read about is that thing you were trying to do at ABC. Can you come over to my office tomorrow and bring some tapes?" Well, I had already written the 5 pilot scripts. I'd already shot the pilot, had the tapes. I said, "Okay, I'm coming reluctantly." So I go over to, and the office is on Beverly Boulevard, second building, owned by George Slaughter. So George Slaughter has the office on my left, and Digby Wolf has the office on the right. And Digby's on the phone, and he comes out and he says, "Can you wait in the hallway a second, John? I have to tend to some business on the phone." So I'm sitting down in the hallway on the sofa. And the door to the left opens, and it's George Slaughter. And he sees me. He says, "Oh, John, what are you doing here?" And we got along great on Laugh-In. Oh, my God. He's very, very witty. George was extremely witty. So I said, "Well, I'm here to see Digby." He said, "Well, come on into my office." So I go into his office. He said, "What have you got there?" And I said, "This is the stuff that Digby wanted to see." He said, "Hold it. Is that stuff you were talking in Variety about, the pilot with Richard Pryor at ABC?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Could you play one of the tapes?" So I had The Stripper for God. There was the first story. There you go. And the second one was a professional vampire hunter. Here was a lawyer in New York who was the only registered vampire hunter. And then we had the unluckiest man in the world. His name was Roy Reap in the Guinness Book of Records as the unluckiest man in the world. Where George is on the floor laughing. He said, "Come over here and sit next to me." So I sit next to him, and he handed me a piece of paper and wrote down $5,000 on the piece of paper. I said, "What's this?" He said, "I have a contract to do 4 specials at NBC called Country versus City. Country music, country jokes versus city music and city jokes." I said, "George, that's a great idea. It's a natural for you. You're so good at that." He said, "But Freddie Silverman called me this morning and asked me if I could do a show about real people. And I will give you $5,000 to appear as a performer." So I write down the note, "What about writer?" So I wrote down $1,500 for writer. And then I wrote down royalty. he wrote down $1,500 for royalties. So there I have $8,000 promised for these 4 specials if I get to do the show with him, and he's good. And here's how smart he was. I said, you call it National Graffiti, which is a great title, John. He said, but I want to call it Real People. And I said, but that sounds so ordinary, George. He says, that's it. Freddie Silverman is very ordinary, but I want him to think he created the title. So we're going to call it Real People. Okay, you can call it Real People. And then I wrote down producer, and he said, no fee for producer because Danny Arnold would probably sue you. So I go home and I say to my wife and my son, I got 4 specials to do in April during my birthday month, and I'm going to get $8,000. Well, it went on to become, as what I predicted, the most successful show in American history.
Wow. Wow.
Now I'm going to tell you something even more believable or unbelievable.
Okay.
Okay. It's when Oliver Stone made JFK. I had been trying. How much time do we have, Angel?
About 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Oh, this is the perfect story. This is the perfect story to sort of end this. God, I wish I could hug you. Anyway.
We'll make that happen one of these days. I promise.
We will. A maskless hug. So
absolutely.
An earplugless hug.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, it was so bizarre because I had tried to tell Jim Garrison's story when I had Real People on the air, and I was sadly sabotaged by George Slaughter, which ended literally my career in television, and I had the proof that George Slaughter could be sued and NBC sued for deliberate libel, but Mr. Garrison just didn't want to do that because he said he'd never see his family again. Just send him some Real People T-shirts, which I did. So anyway, when Oliver bought the book on the Trail of the Assassins to make the movie, right away a guy named George Lardner, he's a CIA asset working for the Washington Post, begins almost immediately attacking Oliver Stone. And you see it in the film. He called it Dallas in Wonderland. That's how he headlined the story. And every day there was this barrage of Lardner attacking Oliver Stone, and Oliver Stone answering brilliantly why the Warren report was a fake and there was no investigation. So I called Oliver's office, and I said, instead of Kevin Costner, I have the real Jim Garrison for 3.5 hours. You're more than welcome, tell Oliver if he executive produces a documentary that I will do, then he'll have it, and would he like to see the tapes? And she called back and said, send the tapes over to Oliver. I said, no, you send Oliver over to me. I'm not letting the tapes out of my sight. She hung up on me. Never heard from Oliver again.
Wow. So
I thought, one of the things I admired about Oliver Stone, not his lifestyle, not his drugs, and none of that, but his dedication to his own work. One of the first movies we made was called Salvador. It is one of the best political thrillers ever made in the United States. And in order to finish it, he had to mortgage his home. And so I thought, I went to my wife and I said, honey, I believe I've never made a documentary. I'm 50 years of age now. I've never made it. I've just made these 8-minute little stories on real people. I've never made a real film. And I said, we have to make a documentary about Jim Garrison. And we don't have the money. I may have to sell the house. Do you mind? And she said, sell the house. Now, we had this beautiful chalet in Toluca Lake. It was right across the street from Walt Disney's brother's house. It was four doors down from Bing Crosby's old house and a block from Bob Hope. But it was a
nice neighborhood.
Oh,
that's a nice neighborhood.
It was the only chalet made out of cedar and brick and glass, 3 stories high. People used to come by and knock on the door and want to take a tour. It was so pretty. So I said to Sarita, I said, we don't need a broker. I'll just put a sign out there for sale by owner. So I put out a sign for sale by owner. I had one of the very first large TV sets in America given to me by NBC as a result of the success of Real People. So I take out the Garrison tapes, I put them on this large screen to make sure that they're in great condition. And there's a buzz at the front door, and I look at the camera, and 3 young guys in suits. They're in their 20s, and they're in suits at the front door. So I let them in, and they introduced themselves. And the older they were named Brunson, and they called themselves the Brunson Brothers. They were very famous trumpet players, very high up in the Mormon religion in Utah. They were stars in Utah. And when they came in the house, the older one, who was the spokesperson, looked at the screen and said, "Is that Jim Garrison, the D of New Orleans?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you mind if I look at this?" And I said, "After you look at the house." And he said, "Well, we don't want to really look at the house." I said, "Well, why did you come in here?" "Well, we came in sort of look at the house, but can we look at a little of this film?" So I ran it for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I stopped it. And he said, "What are you trying to do?" And I said, "I have to make a documentary about this, and I don't have the money, so I'm putting the house up for sale. Do you and your brothers want to buy it?" And they said, "No, we're just looking at interesting houses all around the valley. And yours is the most interesting. And we just looked at one up in the mountains. There's a guy named Lamar Card. His father's a mega millionaire cigarette manufacturer, and this guy's moving to LA to make movies," he said, "and he bought a house up there in the hills, and we saw it. His name is Lamar Card." And so he said to me, "How much do you need?" And I said, $200,000. I said, and he said, "What if we can get it for you?" I said, "You mean you guys have $200,000? He said, "No." And I said, "Well, you know Mormons who have $200,000? He says, "Well, I know a lot of Mormons who have 200,000, but I don't know them. I know of them. But I think I could introduce you to Lamar Card, whose father's a multimillionaire." And I said, "Hold it a second. This sounds like a really bad B movie. Here's what I'll do. If you think you can get me $200,000, I'm going to write a little paragraph giving you 10% of what I earn for the next 7 years if we get to make this documentary." So I signed this like an idiot. What am I wasting my time for? And I hand it to him. Then next morning, I get a phone call. And the guy says, "John Barbour?" I said, "Yes." He said, "This is Lamar Card."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Who?" "Lamar Card." I said, "You mean the friend of the trumpet players?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, "Where are you, in your new home?" And he said, "No, I'm in my new office on Santa Monica Boulevard. Do you really have video on Jim Garrison?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you mind if you bring it over so I take a look at it?" So I thought, oh, I got nothing to lose. So I pick it up, go over that afternoon. We put it in. Lamar Card does not sit down for the entire 3.5 hours staring at the screen, saying, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." He said, "You have a political Woodstock here. I mean, this will be a monster hit after JFK with Kevin Costner." He said, "How much do you need?" And I said, $200,000. He said, "I've got it." And then he said, "On one condition." I said, "What?" He said, "My favorite movie was called Sex, Lies, and Videotape." He said, "Would you call it the Garrison Tapes?" I said, "That is the perfect name for it." So that's how it's got its name. And that's how I got my money.
There's no such thing as a coincidence, John. There's no such thing as things just happen. You know, we're spiritual beings living in we're spiritual beings living in a physical body, in my viewpoint. And I feel like, you know, they always say that luck is hard work meets opportunity. I say it's hard work meets opportunity with the spark of God in the middle of it. You know, it's a God thing. You know, when things are bigger than you and things that could not have ever happened just on your own. To me, that's God's hand in directing your paths.
Well, you know, you'd be amazed. I have 5,000 Facebook friends, and I'm sure that 4,000 of them are believers in God. And I've had a number, especially women, ask me why I don't say I'm an atheist. Why do I say I'm agnostic? Because they said when we first started reading about you years ago, you said you were an atheist. I said, I stopped being an atheist because I don't know there is not a God. And from the experiences that I've had, I have literally had what I can only call divine intervention in my life, because these were all accidents. All these great things happen by accident. My disasters are the things that I plan. These are somebody else's plan. How could I be chosen to be Jim Garrison's Boswell? How could I be chosen to be the person to do Real People on television? I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. And I am in awe of it. That's why I'm only an agnostic, because there is room for belief. And I must tell you honestly, Angel, I believe there is something at work in the universe that is of a positive nature. Do you know that in nature, everything in nature is in motion? The universe is in motion. Every cell in your body is in motion. Even when you die, when you're turned to dust, you decay in emotion. The only thing that's not in emotion are conservative politicians. But in any event, everything is in motion, and it seems to be an emotion for good. While I've often said I believe that evil has more power than good, I'm not so sure of that, because if you take a healthy body and inject two cancer cells in it, it could be dead in 6 weeks or 2 months. Or you could take a cancerous body and put all the living cells in it and it still dies. Because that has always bothered me, that evil should have such a force in this world. And if you look at the world we live in now, which is filled with evil. But on the other hand, there are those wonderful things and those wonderful people like yourself, that keep us going.
Well, that's what, to me, the Bible says faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's the evidence. It's there's a bigger force than all of us. And all I have to do, John, I've been working really hard. As you know, I've done over 400 interviews in the last year on all this COVID stuff. And usually I do about 30 a year. And I've been spending an enormous amount of time kind of going through immunology and all the different things because everybody's always talking about their immune system, their immune system, their immune system. Well, I just created a course. I just finished it last Friday night on the basics of the immune system. Because I said, everybody's always talking about the immune system. They don't know what the heck they're talking about. So I wanted to give people a core course on the basics of the immune system. And then there's these 3 next courses that I'm doing on the illegalities of the COVID shot, what the shots are all about, and the horrific side effects that we're going to see. Well, having said that, it always amazes me, when I take a really super deep dive into immunology, because it just shows me God's in every cell in our body. And there's these little things in our body, they're receptors. They're receptors on the surface of our cells. They call our barrier system in our immune system. So it's the parts of us that interface with the outside world, like our skin, your mouth, your GI tract, your sinuses that interface. And the linings of all of those and all of our blood vessels is something called toll-like receptors, Toll, toll-like receptors. They were just discovered in 2011. This is brand new physiology. And what they do is they've discovered 10 of them in humans so far. And what they do is all day long, is they do this hypervigilance thing, that they just scan the universe all day long, and they look for things that don't belong there. It's like this, our microbiomes, our normal self, what's supposed to be there, and they look for things that aren't there. And they don't recognize things. So for example, in your bloodstream, they know what is part of you, what's the normal part of your microbiome, your bacteria that are supposed to be there. And then there's the ones that are not supposed to be there. And all day long, what they're doing is they're actually scanning the universe, looking for what's not supposed to be there. And they don't recognize it by receptor, like lock and key. They recognize it by pattern recognition. That they know well enough, they know well enough what's going on inside of our bodies to recognize by pattern that doesn't belong here and this does belong here.
Angel, you know what? the best thing in the world is for your immune system?
Love.
Happiness.
And
Happiness.
so I want to finish up by saying that, John, that when I discovered about the toll-like receptors, and this is like just happening to me, it was like God on each side of our cells. And it reminded me of Psalm 139 that says, I will give thanks and praise to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it well. For it was you who created my inward parts and knitted me together in my mother's womb. And when I think about all those intricacies of the cells, how you can take a sperm and an egg and put it together and end up with a body, you
Yes.
know, and it divides and it knows which those three layers go into which organ systems and all the nerves that come together. That cannot just be coincidence. And we didn't arise out of the primordial soup. It's like a divinely created thing that could only come from the hands of God.
Even Shakespeare said it. What a work of wonder man is.
Exactly.
He was indeed inspired, but nobody can write that stuff. It comes from some other place. The reason I said happiness, when I was a critic in Los Angeles, there was a wonderful teacher at UCLA that got cancer, a fellow, wonderful teacher, friend, got cancer and went home to die. And he said, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die laughing. So what he did, he got every Abbott and Costello film, every Three Stooges film, every Marx Brothers film, every funny film he could see. 6 months later, he had no cancer. And he wrote a book about it. The road to health is happiness and laughter.
Wasn't it Norman Cousins who said laughter is the best medicine?
It is the best medicine.
And
There
he
is no
actually,
question about it.
he did that because, and it's because it's joy. And there's actually physiological reasons for that. I mean, when you laugh, you move your lymphatics move, your white blood cells perk up. They can actually measure it by electronic emissions. It's God within us, John. It's
Well,
God within us.
it's like you, Angie. The reason you glow, look at you have no makeup on and you're glowing because you love what it is you do. And I love what it is that I do. Whether I made money at it or never made money at it, I'm still doing what I love to do. When I was a kid, I survived on listening to stories on the radio, watching them in the movies, reading them in books. And now that I'm older, my joy is in telling them, whether it's in a one-line joke or in a story.
And aren't you a marvelous storyteller? Oh my goodness. And I'm envious of your brain and the detail that you remember for so many years ago. Oh my goodness. That's just amazing.
It's incomprehensible to me because I remember stuff that I don't even think I wanted to remember. It's like anything I've read is somehow up there. It just pops out of me. It just pops out. And I can't tell you, Sherri, how I love just talking with you and being around you because you talk about, and in talking about beliefs, you're talking about the core of everybody's being and why we keep going and why we keep growing.
So with that, John, as we're closing out here the last couple of minutes today, what would you like to be your take-home message? You said these were stories and things that you'd never really talked about with anybody before. What would you like to close today out with before we end our deep dive for today?
I don't know that I have anything really positive to say. I never give advice. Honest to God, I never give advice. I amass advice all the time, and I just never give it. All I can suggest is listening to Dr. Tenpenny or listening to Joseph Campbell or reading the Bible, and that is follow your joy. And the only advice I guess I ever gave to somebody, I said, if you want to, because people say to me, John, I don't know what I want to do. There's so many things I'm interested in. I said, you want to find out how to find out what you love? Have you got a good imagination? I think so. Okay, imagine you have just won $25 million in Powerball, or you've won $25 million in Megapot, or whatever it is. Just imagine you got $25 million. Now you have no more financial worries. What are you going to do the rest of your life?
Exactly.
And if you can pinpoint what it is, and you may not even need money for that, but I'm going to tell you something. If you can pinpoint what it is you want to do the rest of your life, what it is that you want to do is worth 10 times what that $25 million is worth. Because if you follow your joy, you will literally know sublime spiritual happiness.
Amen to that, brother. That's really true. See, I had to weave that in there a little bit. I just had to.
You are a doll.
Oh, thank you so much. John, thank you so much for spending your time with me today and for our premium guests here at the Deep Dive. And I want you to it's just such a pleasure. I'm sure we're going to have a part 4 of this just because it's just such a joy to get together and have conversations about just amazing stories and historical things and behind the scene things that none of us would ever know about.
Well, the last time we chatted, you said, John, I would love sometime when you come on to pick 3 stories from your book and tell us about them. And I literally picked 3 stories.
Okay, well, you're setting us up for part 4 here. Well, you're a great producer. You're a great producer.
Oh, Angel, the 3, they're wonderful. They stand by themselves. Only one of them is about a famous star. It's about Lucille Ball and George Burns. The other 2 are not about anybody famous, but they are fabulous stories that you would absolutely, totally love, and they're totally unknown.
Well, there we go, John. Now, see, there's your television and radio background setting us up for the next episode. Yes, it comes through. You're like the great producer. Now we just got set up for the next episode, so I'll have to get back with Michelle and figure out the next time we can come back and talk about that. So as we're leaving, tell people your 2 books, the 2 books that you have now.
The first book is called Your Mother's Not a Virgin, The Bumpy Life and Times of the Canadian Dropout Who Changed the Face of American Television. And the other one that just went up yesterday is called John Barbour, The Wittiest Man in America is a Canadian. Now, if you go to my site, www.johnbarbersworld.com, not only can you see the first Garrison tapes for nothing, you'll see the links to both of the books and also the link to the film that Sherri and I talked about earlier, which is The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. By far the most important movie ever made in America. And again, I would rather talk to you than anybody.
Oh, bless your heart. Well, listen, with that, we're going to close out for today. And now we've got a next episode already queued up here that we're going to do this.
My lucky number, by the way.
That's that. So, John Barbour, thank you so much. It's just been such a delight. Each one of these just gets a little bit better. So we'll put in the show notes the hook to the link to his website, the names of his books and those things. And you really do need to go out and watch those movies. They're historical nature and so important for our times.
And so thank you again for putting Donald Jeffries on the air in April. You will love him. He is a sweet soul like you. He's written 5 great books, and you will be doing 3 or 4 or 5 shows with him too, I promise you.
That's awesome. So with that, let's close with my favorite Bible verse. It's how I close out every one of my shows, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Until we see again the next time this week, stay strong, and we'll see you again real soon. Thank you so much for your participation. And thank you, John. We'll see you again real soon.